This is live on our YouTube channel now, but we'll also have it as like a proper YouTube video later that we can send
So
links.
yeah, brother and sister can just dot end it. You want me to hold the phone?
No, it's fine, I think. Thank you. Do you know whether we can turn this one 180 degrees?
What are we doing? What are we turning though?
Just this top
Just that
bit, so
bit.
that this thing is on the...
On that?
Yeah, thank you.
That's right.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah,
Okay.
just like hold it.
Okay, yeah. All good.
Just make sure it's not on that button there.
Yeah, I just had that. It was in a call emergency. No thanks. Not need it right now.
And then informing it, and then suddenly the beats were everywhere all over the floor. We were outside in the mud, in the mud, and it was like, "Is it raining?" Yeah, it's raining. Yeah, it was dark. So yeah, it was just raining.
Hi everyone, we're so excited to have Dana here to talk about youthful agency and climate justice. So thank you for coming all the way from MSc, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for having me. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Oh, well, hi everyone. I'm Dana. I'm a third-year student at LSE and I study social policy. I basically conducted this research for LSE last year, and I was granted the opportunity to present it here, so I thought might get your opinions on it. And yeah, basically, just a bit about myself. I'm Saudi Arabian, but I've obviously been living in London for academic reasons, and I feel like that just kind of helps me, just shape the narrative here. So obviously coming from a country like Saudi Arabia, I feel like one of the biggest culture shocks I faced here was basically people exercising insurgent citizenship and just the way political rights are played out in different countries. And 2022, 2023, living in London, I've seen a lot of these forms of insurgent citizenship, like non-violent civil disobedience, so like specifically Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. And I've actually met quite a few members of those organizations, but like informally. And I just felt it was really interesting to look at their views of their organizations, but also like in context of 2023's Public Order Acts, which basically increased the policing of protests, specifically minorities participating in these protests. Sorry, I might spit too far. But yeah, so I started looking at these organizations and the kinds of people that participate in them, and it was really surprising to see that the average age in 2020 was 41 years old. That really caught my attention, and obviously I tried to factor in the pandemic and the different reasons, and potentially accounting for outliers and really kind of older members of these organizations. But again, I felt like there wasn't enough light cast on the minorities in these organizations and why they weren't as vocal, or not necessarily as vocal, but why the attention wasn't directed to them. So I started looking at research, specifically looking at intersectional climate justice, and I kind of contrasted that with environmentalism, which was more positivist and looking at the physical environment and the technological change that could solve the climate catastrophe, but not the underlying social inequalities. And then there was a lot of literature as well on advocacy mechanisms, so looking at things like the Arab Spring and how that led to a lot of scholarly literature to talk about how people advocate for certain causes, but using media instead of physically being at a place. And then, of course, there was this big debate on post-politicization, where we looked at whether people believed that the climate catastrophe was no longer a political thing. It was just a physically objective catastrophe that is about to happen, which is true. But the argument that I was trying to make is that it is in fact very political, because the people who are able to even advocate for climate change are a very specific set of people. And things like climate refugees, if you look at the main demographics of these refugees, they're mostly people from the so-called global south, and not from affluent socioeconomic backgrounds either. Just briefly, I've conducted qualitative research, so I've done no quantitative research, but I've conducted in-depth interviews with climate activists that were based around Europe, but mostly those who were living in London at the time of the interviews. And yeah, sorry, I'm going a bit too fast, but I thought this was my main finding, or my main contribution, which is basically to break down the experience of activism into three main factors. So I kind of positioned initially the agent as the first one. So I kind of looked at personal experiences and looking at, looking inward at the person themselves, looking at the activists themselves and seeing their lives, their households, the household relations, looking at parental authority in the household, the cultures that were experienced in the household when it came to climate change. But then I've kind of integrated that into the political sphere, understanding government regulations and how the external environment that you're in, even the school you go to, actually directs or informs the information that you're able to receive, but also limits the actions that you're able to take yourself as an individual. And both of those factors together feed into your action as an activist. So they feed into what some people would refer to as a spectrum of agency, or a spectrum of activism, whether it's a social media post, or in my case, I even argue that a discussion at the dinner table with your family can be a political activist kind of notion. But then going all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is nonviolent civil disobedience. But then there is also a secondary argument, which is saying, well, there is no unilateral spectrum of agency or activism. Rather, it's highly contextualized, and so at the end of the day, it's just kind of food for thought. But yeah, so when looking at the agents themselves, I thought it was really interesting to look at the story of a Canadian Chinese student that was in Honduras working on research there, and what she found is that a protest she attended led to one of the organizers being killed. So initially it was a gunshot, I believe, and then crowds started piling up and beating the person to death. And it was actually a protest against an oil rig that was meant to be built there, but the conflict or the contestation was between indigenous people and the government, and private corporations, of course. And so looking at how she was saying that led to her reflection, and seeing that she was living in Vancouver at the time, she felt relatively safe. She felt like she had the privilege of being able to protest safely, and that inspired her to actually spend her summer working in the Wild Trees Project, I believe, where she kind of spent the summer in the jungles with the trees, making sure that the trees weren't cut down, which is kind of closer to non-violent disobedience. But yeah, so just looking at the Asian themselves, their inspiring stories, or one of the other interviewees talked about how her parents were highly kind of strict. They wouldn't let her even become like vegan. They wouldn't let her have control over her food choices. And to her, the negotiations she had at the dinner table were a symbol of her activism. And then just kind of the pictures on the side highlight also your positionality as a person. So just the passport you hold, or whether you even hold a passport, but then also, you know, your positionality within the household as well. So are you kind of a younger daughter, or are you kind of highly independent and able to make decisions on your own? Yeah, basically. So being an Asian, I thought was a great starting point to looking at the person themselves, not the movement or the organization they're a part of. And then I moved on to politics, which is kind of the second part of the cycle, where we looked at small-scale interactions, specifically looking at one of the participants talked about creating networks with other student societies across the UK, and they basically had these weekly meetings where they'd write letters to their local MPs. And then other participants also talked about the overlapping values they found. So some people didn't even start as climate activists, they rather just started fighting against like animal cruelty or testing on animals in the cosmetics industry, and how them holding these values and these collective civil organizations having these values actually led to them kind of developing these networks and studying or even pursuing careers in climate activism space. And then again, just bringing this back to kind of a regulating authority, the project kind of takes a positive outlook on politics, kind of saying, well, does your government enable you to participate in these projects? But I'm also trying to argue that there is the case of the opposite, where people can intervene and actually hinder your possibilities of engaging in climate activism. And this kind of recent article I found, I thought linked perfectly, which talks about the invented and invited spaces of participation. And the whole argument of the article is trying to say, well, are the spaces that you're able to participate in invented by non-governmental organizations? Is it civil society collecting basically, you know, members of the general public and creating spaces that enable you to participate in a movement or promote a movement? Or rather, are they invited spaces where regulating authority is actually directing your activity and telling you where you can or cannot talk about certain things, or the different actions that you can take? And then if you combine the two, that takes you into action. So again, a lot of literature talks about tangible initiatives, so things that basically you can count or even touch. So things basically like regulating your own consumption and buying things that are, let's say, from a food waste kind of saving collective. But then there's also an intangible initiative that I thought should be taken into account, which is just the activity of learning. So just the activity of people picking up books, buying these books even, and then creating networks and societies and even reading groups that I've found that have started their entire collectives based on just the idea or just the opportunity basically presented by a teacher in school. And that kind of brings me back to the whole spectrum I mentioned earlier, which is the scale of the action, and whether the scale of the action, it does matter, but whether the scale of the action actually matters as much as the agency of the individual in this case. So things as small as discussions at the dinner table, people would not often assume would be a form of political activism, but my research kind of highlights the contrary, where people were talking about these discussions as moments where they realized they were willing to devote their lives and careers to this. But then also this cycle I found was not only applicable to climate activism, so I tried to take it out of climate activism and see where it could also be applied. And I found it worked pretty well with non-democratic contexts. So things specifically looking at the smaller side of the spectrum. So things like personal consumption, social media, or even using social media to support networks that were forming at the time. I believe were circumstances where we could apply that model and still see that same thing, where you're highlighting the agency of the individual. And of course, the agency itself can be a very, it can be very polarizing, if I will, because at the end of the day, who are we to ask someone whether what they've done is enough? But then again, you can clearly tell when it's not enough. And then also applying it to non-climate social movements, but then, so in that specifically, just how external environments actually manipulate your mobilization of your own agency. So things like censorship I thought were really interesting in that case, especially with causes such as Free Palestine, where I personally know for a fact a university in France actually suspended students for using their private accounts to advocate. And that just shows that even in a so-called democratic context, that's not necessarily the case when it comes to your individual agency, especially as a minority. Sorry, that was very quick, but I have to say the key takeaways that I thought were really prominent in my research was that at the end of the day, climate activism does not operate in a vacuum. We need to take into account the different contextual factors that shape someone's involvement in a movement and the scale of their involvement themselves. Two people can come from the same household yet contribute in very different ways. And yeah, again, context and also activism tend to be co-constructive of each other. And that's what I thought was very much prominent in the case of Just Stop Oil defacing paintings in the past. So just the pushing of the boundaries actually changes the environment itself. So, there is the case or the argument for challenging external environments, but of course, that's kind of a decision to be made by the individual themselves. And then again, there is no single universal image of the ideal climate activist. But at the end of the day, what ties most of these activists together is their common shared values, especially in the case of things like climate justice, intersectional climate justice, but also things like ensuring that the consequences of climate change are distributed equitably. Yeah, sorry, I have some words cited there, just references if anyone needs them. Thanks.
Yeah, I just have a quick question about your research and if anything kind of came up when you were working that sort of surprised you. Because you were talking about the dinner table conversations, and I was just wondering if there was anything around that kind of surprised you.
I have to say, personally, I went into the research looking for the smaller side of activism, just because that was my personal frame of reference. I was using what I knew. But what surprised me with especially dinner table conversations is actually the case where one of the participants told me about one of the times Just Stop Oil blocked a bridge, in London, and how at the dinner table her dad was talking to her about how that led him to be very late to work. And he was complaining about being very, very late to work. And she came from a working class family, so that was a very big deal to her dad. But then she, upon reflection, was telling me that the protest was nowhere near where her dad works or the route her dad takes to work. And I'm not one to kind of infer why her dad would say such a statement, but even she was thinking about why that was the case. So I feel like dinner time conversations, aren't just let's not drive around London, let's take the train, but just those kind of micro scale activities really show you where people stand. And thanks, that was Sure, go ahead.
Where do you want to take the work that you're doing? Where do you want to take it forward?
Honestly, I've kind of had different ways of approaching it. So one of the ways that I've tried to use the research in other aspects is I'm currently working as a part-time consultant for an environmental consulting firm. And in that, they work with a lot of transnational advocacy networks. So I think it's FIPRA, the managing director of the company actually founded the FIPRA Alliance. And so doing a lot of research on that and trying to understand the different initiatives happening. So I work a lot in mapping and stakeholder mapping, where we kind of collect these different initiatives and try to understand how different people advocate, but in a way that still secures their safety. I think it's in Latin America, there's the ideology of summa cose, which is to live in harmony with nature, which is very kind of anti-capitalist. But the way it's used there is kind of in daily practices, and yeah, sorry, it's a very like politicized notion, but I think taking this research just into like different fields is very beneficial. Sorry, I don't know if that was your question. Yeah, sure.
I really like the idea of looking at very small action scales, and I was wondering whether you saw any impact on activists' mental health or just like the feeling of agency if they had these options of doing action on a micro scale.
I honestly, at the time, I was only trained for a certain level with like the LSE like code of like data ethics. So I wasn't able to touch on things like mental health, if we're being very honest. But what I could infer based on what people were saying is there tended to be a sense of hopelessness, especially with people that were like on a daily basis exposed to very small acts of activism. So a lot of people talked about kind of climate change being a taboo topic in the workplace. And some of them, let's say, have changed their dietary kind of ways of going about life just for the sake of climate change, and that led to a lot of difficult conversations when it came to like lunchtime and eating out at work. So I would say a lot of people talked about like being hopeless at some point or feeling like they were never doing enough. And I think in that case there tended to be quite a bit of negative mental health effects. But I think it's still important to note that no one actually stopped being an activist, that people kept going. And that had a lot to do with the reason why they got engaged in the first place. Anything else?
Well, thank you so much for that talk. And I think we'll